The Radeon RX 7600 XT from AMD is a last-gen RDNA 3 card with 16GB of VRAM, and it costs just under £300. The RTX 5060 Ti uses the newest GPU architecture from Nvidia, and it also costs just under £300. One is the cheapest 16GB card you can buy brand new in the UK right now. The other is about the most expensive you can get with just 8GB on board. So, if you've got £300 to spend on a graphics card in 2025, which one should you buy? If either of them. This video was brought to you by FlexiSpot and the C7 Morpher ergonomic chair. One of the main reasons I started out on YouTube was because a back injury made it painful and potentially hazardous to keep doing my old retail job. Being able to work from home means I don't have to risk injuring my back anymore, but it also means I need a supportive, comfortable chair to work from, which I didn't get from whatever that random thing was I picked up from Amazon. FlexiSpot's C7 series have been a game changer for me, making it easier and more comfortable to sit for long days capturing gameplay footage, running benchmarks and editing videos. The C7 Morpher is, I think, the most advanced thing I've ever sat in. Starting from the top, it has a 3D articulated headrest for all shapes of neck and all working positions. The Flex Lean upper back support adjusts up to 10 degrees, helping you keep your shoulders relaxed as you work, while the Air lumbar support can be inflated to adjust pressure on your lower back. The next-gen hybrid mesh-addressed cushion reduces pressure on your hips by up to 20% and increases breathability by 30% because, well, you know. And you can adjust the seat depth to whatever's most comfortable for you. The 5D armrests pivot outwards and inwards to support more natural arm positions and help you in your Bond villain cosplay, and also recline as the chair does. Speaking of which, you get 160 degrees to lean back, the lumbar support adjusts automatically to match your reclined position, and you can slide out the optional footrest for the optimal gamer position. The C7 Morpher comes with a 10-year warranty, and if you're not satisfied with your chair, there's a 30-day no-questions-asked returns policy. Check out the C7 Morpher and the rest of FlexiSpot's range at the link below, and use my code for the best price. For a bit of context, let me recap the story so far. Earlier this year, Nvidia and AMD released their latest generation graphics cards, the RTX 50 series and RX 9000 series respectively. These were fine, of course. Great even, but they also didn't seem to fully get what gamers need in 2025. Over the last few years, VRAM has become a precious resource in modern games, and if you don't have enough, then your expensive new GPU could be stuck running new games at reduced quality settings and resolutions, or otherwise risk graphical errors, performance drops, and crashes. This might not be a problem in a cheap entry-level GPU aimed at esports, but the 8GB RX 9060 XT and RTX 5060 Ti are £280 or $350. It's not unreasonable to expect a graphics card that costs almost as much as a base model console to let you do a bit of AAA gaming, preferably somewhere above 1080p. The obvious answer to this is to spend more. The two offending cards are available in 16GB variants, costing £50 to £100 more than the 8GB versions, but I feel like that answer's too obvious. Spending more should get you more, that's the way it's supposed to work. However, there is another option. In the UK right now, you can pick up a brand new 16GB RX 7600 XT for around the same price as the 8GB 5060 Ti. It's only one generation old, it supports ray tracing, and it has VRAM for days. Can the cheapest 16GB card succeed where the most expensive 8GB one fails? To answer that question, my test platform is the MPG PC, with a Ryzen 5 7500F along with 32GB of DDR5 on a B650 motherboard. I've tested slightly fewer games than usual, and I've been quite deliberate in my choices. Some games are known for being VRAM hogs, some quite the opposite, and each of them is made using a different engine. Although I'm sure one UE5 game is already too many for some of you. I've tested at a number of resolutions and quality settings to give a more rounded idea of when 8GB is enough and when it isn't. Starting with 3 games built on proprietary engines, all of which were made for consoles. The Last of Us Part 2 is a PlayStation port of the remastered version, originally intended for the base PS5, which has access to around 12.7GB of VRAM. The first game was notoriously VRAM heavy when it arrived on PC, so it's no surprise that the sequel has kept up this reputation. While the 5060 Ti is almost flawless at 1080p, often beating the Radeon by almost double, that all starts to fall apart above the high presets. At very high, the game runs out of VRAM after a couple of minutes and slows down horribly, and even DLSS can't save it. The 7600 XT might have a lower average FPS at very high, but it has the better experience in the long run. The 5060 Ti needs dropping to high or below to guarantee a decent experience. 1440p is naturally much the same, with the 8GB card falling apart at the higher quality settings. However, if 60fps is your bar for decent gameplay, the Radeon is stuck running at very low, and even then it can fall short. The 5060 Ti can go up to 1440p medium and still look and play better than the Radeon. Nixie's PC port of Insomniac's Spider-Man 2 has been rough going. I don't think it's possible to get a flat frame time graph without capping the frame rate, or else using frame generation and coping with the problems that causes. The 5060 Ti still has the edge at 1080p without ray tracing, and again maintains it all the way up to the high presets, though the low percentile numbers are just a fact of life with this game, and not the fault of the GPU. At very high, the 7600 XT takes the lead on average, and the 1% lows also favour the AMD card, though are, of course, still terrible in their own right. At 1440p, the two cards draw level at high settings, at least on average. The 5060 Ti remains painful to play thanks to the increased stutter, and falls apart completely at very high. With ultimate ray tracing enabled, neither card is particularly up to the task, and even quality upscaling doesn't improve matters enough to hit the 60 mark, but in something of a subversion of what you might expect, given RDNA 3's reputation for trailing behind in RT, the 7600 actually leads the 5060 Ti here. Despite having been out on PC for some 4 years at this point, releasing long before the VRAM panic of 2023, and being something of a poster child for smooth-running games, Forza Horizon 5 can be something of a VRAM hog. If your settings are too high, you'll get an error message before long, and if you ignore that message, you might see missing textures and assets, or even crash altogether. That being said, 8GB isn't too much of a problem here, at least in my testing. I could force the game to give an immediate VRAM warning by turning up to 1080p extreme with maximum ray tracing, but other than that, 1080p was completely playable. Given how subtle the RT effects are, you can only really spot the difference from the self-reflections in car windows and under the spoiler. That's not a big sacrifice to make. At 1440p things look pretty similar, but this time I saw real performance problems with the 5060 Ti maxed out. Not so much in the benchmark test, but I took both cards out for a drive through Mexico at max settings and saw far more problems with the GeForce. It's a shame because otherwise both GPUs could handle this title quite nicely. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 runs on CryEngine, and as someone who was a fan of both Far Cry and Crysis back in the 2000s, it's strange to hear a game made on this engine being held up as a pinnacle of optimization. Still, Here we are. KCD2 isn't known for being particularly heavy on VRAM, and that's a favour to the 5060 Ti. It leads the 7600 XT at 1080p all the way up to ultra settings. It's really only the experimental preset that causes the 8GB card problems, and they're pretty significant ones. The average is close at just over 36 FPS, but the 1% lows are what separate the two. The Nvidia card suffers from significantly more stutters. At 1440 meanwhile, the 5060 Ti isn't even in the running. The 7600 walks all over it at every quality preset. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is a widely loved game outside of the PC nerd space, with many people picking it for Game of the Year already. Some of our lot don't like it because it's built on Unreal Engine 5, and that means... well, let's see what it means. Initially, it appears that the 5060 Ti is the clear winner at every resolution and setting, but actually it's a bit more complicated than the charts might suggest. At 1080p Epic, we start to see signs that the 5060 Ti isn't holding up, with 1% lows falling below the Radeon despite being 40% faster overall. That might not be something you'll notice in gameplay, depending on how sensitive you are to frame time spikes, but you will notice during cutscenes. The 8GB cards start showing major performance drops at 1080p high, and it gets particularly bad at Epic. Both the 8GB and 16GB cards are locked to 30 now, but the GeForce is much harder to tolerate. And this is a story-heavy game, so it's a bigger problem than it might be in other titles. At 1440p, the chart doesn't look too bad for the 5060 Ti. In fact, performance is close to what the 7600 XT saw at 1080p. But again, those cutscenes are a major problem. And this is the opening chapter of the game. I dare say things could get even worse over time. Rockstar's Rage engine has been powering GTA 5 for 12 years now, with minor updates in 2015 and more major ones in 2022 and 2025. The PC version has some updated assets and additional ray tracing. However, this also means the game no longer runs above minimum settings on 4GB graphics cards, at least without dropping to PS3-like resolutions. The cards in this video, however, have very few problems. At minimum and high, they're limited to around 160 FPS, and I think this might be related to the engine more than any hardware bottlenecks. The 5060 Ti remains largely at or around this cap at every setting at both 1080p and 1440p, with only the very high preset dipping below 140. The 7600 XT falls off much earlier, but is still very playable across the board. Meanwhile, ray tracing is quite punishing for the Radeon, but never seems to have a negative impact on the GeForce. Obviously GTA 6 will be a different matter, but for those of you still playing 5, this whole VRAM business is a lot of fuss over nothing. I flipped a coin for which id Tech game to test, and Indiana Jones lost. Doom the Dark Ages isn't quite as harsh when it comes to VRAM. If your GPU doesn't cut the mustard in Indy, you'll have any number of glitches to deal with, whereas Doom seems a little friendlier. I didn't experience any glitches or crashes on the 8GB card, which is more than I can say for the last 4GB model I tried in this game. There's precious little difference between the top 4 image quality settings, either in appearance or in performance, so maybe this is a little less consequential than you might think. The 7600 XT fails to hit 60 FPS at native resolution at any quality setting. The 7600 XT fails to hit 60 FPS at native resolution at any quality setting, whereas the 5060 Ti actually acquits itself quite well at 1080p. At least, that's the case with the textures set to the lowest setting. Turning them up to 4GB has about zero impact on the 16GB Radeon, whereas the 8GB GeForce falls on its face at medium and never gets up again. At the beginning of the video, I asked the question, which of these two cards should you buy, if either of them? The blanket answer from my colleagues on YouTube is that nobody should buy the 8GB 5060 Ti, and I'm not going to argue with them. However, it's perhaps not as bad as I'd feared. If you hate modern games or just want the best esports card possible without overspending on memory you don't need, I guess I can see a scenario where this isn't the worst purchase you could make. Meanwhile, the 7600 XT was disappointing in 2024, and time hasn't helped. At £280, it's too close to the 9060 XT, which has at least a generation's worth of extra performance, especially in ray tracing, and it can run FSR4 for DLSS-like upscaling. If we're talking about a used or open box card, then maybe at £200 or less, then it could be a viable option. But I wouldn't recommend buying a RX 7600 XT for any more than that. So, that pretty much sounds like I'm saying neither of them wins? And that's probably a fair assessment. Unfortunately, the only thing I can honestly recommend on the new market right now is a 16GB 5060 Ti or 9060 XT. Or save your money and get a cheaper 8GB card. I know I'd feel a bit better about being stuck at 1080p medium if I'd spent closer to £200 than £300. On the other hand, if you're not against the idea of buying used, this kind of money might get you something closer to the 5060 Ti in terms of performance without sacrificing VRAM. The RX 6800 might be a generation older than the 7600 XT, but it should still be a fair bit more potent. You might find a 7700 XT for a good deal, or maybe even the RTX 3080 would just about fall into this price category. If you want to see how the 12GB 3080 fares against the full-fat 16GB 5060 Ti, that video will be on screen shortly. Thanks again to FlexiSpot for sponsoring the video. Check out the C7 Morpher and the rest of their series of ergonomic chairs at the link below. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.